Good morning, afternoon, or evening, history buffs, and welcome back to Boring History, the channel where we take the dullest moments of the past and polish them into, well, slightly less dull moments. Today, we're diving headfirst into a year so utterly, spectacularly, catastrophically chaotic that it makes your average Tuesday feel like a tranquil monastic retreat. Forget everything you thought you knew about Roman imperial stability, because in 238 AD, the empire decided to throw an unprecedented, blood-soaked game of musical chairs with the throne. We're talking about a year that saw not one, not two, but 6 emperors ascend and fall. 6 emperors in 12 months. Imagine that level of corporate instability. Your CEO changes monthly, and usually through violent means. This wasn't just a leadership crisis, it was a political earthquake, a civil war, and a psychological trauma that would set the stage for Rome's terrifying crisis of the 3rd century. So settle in, because we're about to dissect the year of the 6 emperors. Our story doesn't begin in 238 AD exactly, but rather with the emperor who unwittingly set the dominoes falling, Maximinus Thrax. Now, the Roman Empire, despite its grandiosity, was always a military state at heart, and Maximinus was the personification of that brutal truth. He was a colossal figure, reputedly over 8 feet tall, with a rough, humble background in Thrace, far from the senatorial palaces of Rome. He'd clawed his way up through the ranks, a soldier, distinguished by sheer physical might and battlefield prowess. When Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops in 235 AD, Maximinus, a general beloved by the legions, was acclaimed emperor. This was a significant moment. For the first time, a man of such low birth, utterly disdainful of the old aristocratic order, sat on the imperial throne. The Senate, Rome's ancient body of gray-haired senators, seethed with resentment. Maximinus, in turn, despised them, viewing them as effete, corrupt relics. He didn't even bother to visit Rome for his official investiture. Maximinus was a warrior emperor through and through. He spent his entire 3-year reign on campaign, fighting Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and he was successful, pushing back barbarian incursions and securing Rome's borders. But victory comes at a price, and Maximinus funded his relentless wars through exorbitant taxation, confiscations, and forced requisitions. He squeezed every last denarius out of the provinces, particularly targeting the wealthy landowning classes who formed the backbone of local administration. His agents were notorious for their brutality, often seizing property and executing those who resisted, all under the pretext of funding the war effort. This heavy-handed approach created a simmering cauldron of discontent across the empire, alienating not just the senatorial elite, but also a vast swath of the provincial population. Maximinus ruled by fear, and while it kept the armies loyal for a time, it built up a dangerous reservoir of hatred. The spark that ignited this tinderbox came unexpectedly from the province of Africa Proconsularis, modern-day Tunisia. In early 238 AD, a particularly avaricious imperial procurator, tasked with collecting taxes, pushed his luck too far. He brought false charges against several prominent landowners, threatening them with ruin and execution unless they paid exorbitant bribes. These landowners, desperate and with nothing left to lose, banded together with their slaves and local peasants. Instead of succumbing, they ambushed the procurator and his guards, killing them all. This act of rebellion, however, left them in a precarious position. They had committed treason against Maximinus Thrax. There was no turning back. Their only hope was to replace the emperor. They needed a figurehead, someone with authority and respect. Their gaze fell upon an elderly, distinguished senator named Marcus Antonius Gordianus Semprianus Romanus, known to history as Gordian I. He was the proconsul of Africa, a man of immense wealth, impeccable aristocratic lineage, and a long, illustrious career of public service, spanning nearly 80 years. He was cultured, educated, and widely respected. The rebels, fearing Maximinus's inevitable wrath, stormed Gordian's residence in Thystris, a city in modern-day Tunisia. They presented him with a stark choice: either accept the purple and lead their rebellion, or die with them as a conspirator. Gordian, an old man who had lived his life in peace and service, was initially horrified. He pleaded his age, his desire for a quiet retirement, but the rebels were insistent, threatening to kill him and everyone he held dear. Faced with such an ultimatum, and perhaps seeing a chance to restore the traditional senatorial order, Gordian reluctantly agreed. But he was shrewd. He understood the optics. A lone octogenarian emperor would appear weak. He needed a co-emperor, a younger, more vigorous face for the rebellion. He immediately elevated his son, Marcus Antonius Gordianus Semprianus Romanus Africanus, known as Gordian II, to the rank of Augustus along with him. Gordian II was a man in his late 40s, known for his love of literature and his somewhat dissolute lifestyle, but he offered a legitimate claim and a capable hand for military command. Together, they established their court in Carthage, the provincial capital. The news of the African revolt and the proclamation of Gordian I and II as emperors spread like wildfire across the Roman world, and nowhere was it received with more fervent enthusiasm than in Rome itself.
The Senate, held in contempt by Maximinus, saw its chance for revenge. They knew that if Maximinus crushed the revolt, their own heads would be next. With a rare burst of courage and unity, they formally recognized Gordian I and II as legitimate emperors, and crucially declared Maximinus Thrax a public enemy. This was an act of audacious defiance, effectively initiating a civil war. Statues of Maximinus were torn down, his officials in Rome were lynched, and the capital erupted in celebrations. Messengers were dispatched across the empire, urging other provinces to side with the new senatorial emperors. Hope, for a moment, flickered that the brutal rule of Maximinus was over. But Maximinus Thrax was not one to be easily dismissed. When the news reached him at his military headquarters on the northern frontier, he was reportedly apoplectic with rage. He had just successfully concluded a campaign against the Sarmatians, and now this, a rebellion led by an 80-year-old aristocrat and his dilettante son, sanctioned by the very Senate he despised. He immediately broke off his northern campaigns and began a forced march south towards Italy, his veteran legions hardened by years of frontier warfare, thirsting for vengeance and the promise of plunder. His march was swift, brutal, and terrifying. The Gordians, however, had little time to savor their newfound imperial status. Africa was a wealthy province, but it lacked a strong military presence. The real power in the region lay with Capelianus, the governor of neighboring Numidia. Capelianus harbored a deep personal grudge against Gordian I, who had once served as his superior. More importantly, Capelianus remained fiercely loyal to Maximinus, or at least saw an opportunity to gain favor. He had legions at his disposal, including the formidable Legia III Augusta, a unit with extensive combat experience. Capelianus marched his forces on Carthage. Gordian II, attempting to prove himself worthy of the purple and eager to defend his father, led a hastily assembled militia of young, inexperienced citizens and palace guards out to meet him. It was a massacre. The battle was short and utterly devastating for the Gordians. Gordian II fought bravely but was overwhelmed and killed on the field. Upon hearing the news of his son's death and the complete collapse of their rebellion, the elderly Gordian I, seeing no escape from Maximinus's inevitable retribution, took his own life. Their reign had lasted a mere 22 days. The swift, brutal end of the Gordians plunged the empire back into an even deeper crisis. The Senate in Rome had publicly declared Maximinus an enemy, committing themselves irrevocably. Their chosen emperors were dead. Maximinus, a colossal of a man and a hardened general, was now marching relentlessly down Italy, his legions a juggernaut of destruction, heading straight for Rome. The Senate had gambled everything and lost. They were now facing the full, terrifying wrath of the emperor they had dared to defy. They needed new emperors, and they needed them fast. The stage was set for the next, even more desperate act of this unprecedented imperial drama.
The stage was set for the next, even more desperate act of this unprecedented imperial drama. Panic gripped the Senate house in Rome. Maximinus Thrax, the very emperor they had dared to depose, was now bearing down on them, his legions fueled by vengeance. Their champions, the Gordians, lay dead. The Senate had committed treason on an imperial scale, and there would be no mercy. They needed emperors, not just quickly, but effectively. Emperors who could command respect, rally armies, and crucially, survive. After a heated and frantic debate, a decision was made that was as radical as it was desperate. They would appoint not one, but two co-emperors. Never before had Rome seen such a measure for its primary rulers. Their choices were Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus and Decius Caelius Calvinus Balbinus, an unlikely and deeply unpopular pairing. Pupienus, though of humble origins, had risen through the ranks of public service to become a senator, prefect of the city, and a successful general. He was 74, experienced, stern, and disciplined, a man respected, perhaps, but certainly not beloved. Balbinus, on the other hand, was 60, a patrician of noble birth, refined, intellectual, and known for his eloquent speeches and luxurious lifestyle. He represented the aristocratic ideal, but lacked any significant military experience. They were diametrically opposed in temperament and background, and they cordially detested each other. The Senate hoped their contrasting strengths would complement each other, but the stark reality was a partnership of mutual suspicion forced together by existential dread. The Roman populace, however, reacted with outrage. Maximinus had been the soldiers' emperor, and the Gordians, particularly the elder, had briefly captured the people's imagination. To replace them with two aloof, elderly senators, one a former commoner, the other an effete aristocrat, was an insult. A furious mob surrounded the Senate house, pelting the senators with stones and demanding a ruler from the beloved Gordian line. The situation quickly spiraled into violent street fighting. The senators, trapped and fearing for their lives, eventually relented. To appease the enraged populace, they were forced to appoint Gordian III, the 13-year-old grandson of Gordian I, as Caesar, effectively heir apparent to Pupienus and Balbinus.
This concession highlighted the Senate's precarious position, beholden not just to the legions, but to the unpredictable will of the Roman mob. The year, still young, already had 6 imperial claimants, 2 deceased, 2 reigning uneasily, and 1 a child heir. With Maximinus Thrax and his unstoppable legions meal weeks away from the capital, time was of the essence. Pupienus, the soldier among the two, immediately took charge of the military preparations. He gathered what meager forces he could from Italy and the Praetorian Guard and marched north to confront Maximinus, leaving Balbinus in Rome to manage the city and quell the lingering unrest. It was a clear division of labor, but also a reflection of their deep mistrust. Neither wanted to leave the other unsupervised in the capital. Maximinus, meanwhile, had reached the strategic city of Aquileia, at the head of the Adriatic Sea. It was a vital crossroads, and Pupienus had ordered its governor, Rutilius Putens, to hold it at all costs. Maximinus, perhaps overconfident or simply underestimating the city's resolve, decided to besiege Aquileia rather than bypass it. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Aquileia, fiercely loyal to the Senate, transformed itself into an impregnable fortress. Its citizens pulled down their own houses outside the walls to deny Maximinus building materials, even sacrificing their women's hair to create bowstrings. From the ramparts, they rained down a relentless hail of projectiles and boiling oil upon Maximinus's legions. The siege dragged on, day after agonizing day. Maximinus, accustomed to swift victories, grew increasingly frustrated. His legions, having marched across vast distances, were now exhausted and demoralized. Supplies dwindled, and disease began to spread through the camp. Maximinus's notorious harshness, once a tool for discipline, now bred resentment. He brutally punished his officers for any perceived failures, alienating those who should have been his most loyal supporters. More ominously, whispers of discontent began to ripple through the ranks, particularly of the Praetorian Guard who had accompanied him. They had been eyewitnesses to the empire's spiraling chaos and the Senate's defiant stand. They feared that if Maximinus failed, they, as his personal guard, would face the full, terrifying vengeance of the Senate. The climax came in April. As Maximinus oversaw operations, surveying the defiant walls of Aquileia, a small group of his own Praetorian Guards approached his tent. Maximinus, unsuspecting, had stepped out to speak to them. Suddenly they seized him, and without a moment's hesitation, cut off his head. His son, Maximus, who was also present and designated Caesar, met the same swift, brutal end. Their heads were mounted on poles and paraded before the walls of Aquileia, a grim message to the besieged city and a terrifying warning to any who would defy the Praetorians. Maximinus Thrax, the formidable Thracian giant and the first emperor to never set foot in Rome, had been eliminated not by external enemies, but by the very soldiers whose loyalty he had cultivated and then squandered. His 3-year reign had ended as violently as it had begun. When the news reached Pupienus in Ravenna, he was relieved beyond measure. The existential threat to the Senate and Rome was gone. The surviving soldiers of Maximinus's army, eager to be absolved of their previous allegiance, quickly pledged loyalty to the new senatorial emperors. Pupienus, hailed as a liberator, then marched back to Rome in triumph, joining Balbinus. The city erupted in celebrations. The crisis, it seemed, was over. But beneath the surface of relief, the victory was hollow. The Praetorians had shown their true power, brutally eliminating an emperor. Their loyalty was bought, not earned, and their allegiance to the new emperors was thin. The underlying tension between the emperors and the Praetorian Guard, and indeed between Pupienus and Balbinus themselves, was now the empire's most pressing and most dangerous internal struggle. The year of the 6 emperors was far from over.
The underlying tension between the emperors and the Praetorian Guard, and indeed between Pupienus and Balbinus themselves, was now the empire's most pressing and most dangerous internal struggle. The year of the 6 emperors was far from over. The honeymoon period for Rome's new senatorial emperors was predictably short-lived. Pupienus and Balbinus, 2 men of disparate backgrounds and temperaments, quickly found their forced alliance fraying under the immense pressure of their shared imperial authority. Pupienus, the seasoned military commander, carried himself with the stern pragmatism of a man who had earned his place through years of battle and command. He commanded the respect, if not always the affection, of the legions. Balbinus, on the other hand, was the quintessential senator, eloquent, refined, and accustomed to the intricate dance of Roman politics and intellectual discourse. He viewed Pupienus's military bluntness with a thinly veiled disdain, seeing it as unbecoming of an emperor. Pupienus, in turn, saw Balbinus's aristocratic sensibilities as a dangerous weakness in an age that demanded decisive, martial leadership. Their palaces, once united in purpose against Maximinus, now became separate spheres of influence, each a hotbed of intrigue and suspicion. They rarely appeared together, and when they did, their interactions were stiff, punctuated by forced smiles and thinly veiled barbs. Each suspected the other of plotting to seize sole power, of attempting to undermine their authority, or of covertly seeking favor with the powerful factions within the city. The Praetorian Guard, whose hands were still stained with the blood of Maximinus, watched this developing rift with a predatory gaze. They had eliminated a formidable emperor just weeks prior. The thought of dispatching 2 more, especially 2 whom they likely considered weak or illegitimate, would not have been far from their minds. The Praetorians, who formed the immediate military presence within Rome, were deeply resentful of the new emperors. They had been excluded from the critical campaigns against Maximinus in Italy, and their loyalty was to the imperial office, not necessarily to the Senate's chosen candidates. Their prestige had been tarnished by the earlier attempts on Maximinus's life, which had failed miserably. Now they felt that Pupianus and Balbinus, representing the Senate, might seek to diminish their power, or worse, replace them with troops more loyal to the new regime. Their allegiance was a fragile commodity, bought with promises and prone to shift with the prevailing winds of power. The 2 emperors, acutely aware of the Praetorians' volatility, were caught in a terrible dilemma. They needed the guard for their protection, yet they simultaneously feared its power. The mutual animosity between Pupianus and Balbinus grew, erupting into public displays that deeply embarrassed the Senate and Rome itself. On one particular occasion, during a public spectacle, their disagreement over some trivial matter escalated into a furious exchange of words. Historians record that they very nearly came to blows in the imperial box, a scene less fitting for imperial majesty and more for gladiatorial combat. Such incidents eroded whatever respect the populace still held for the imperial office, and more dangerously, further emboldened the Praetorians. Their constant bickering paralyzed the administration, leaving vital decisions regarding frontier defense and public works unmade. Rome, having just endured a civil war, desperately needed strong, unified leadership, but instead found itself saddled with 2 bickering co-regions. The climax of this internal strife arrived in July of 238 AD, during the height of Rome's ancient Capitoline Games, or Ludi Secularis. The city was alive with festivities, the streets thronged with citizens celebrating the quadrennial spectacle. The noise and revelry provided the perfect cover for the Praetorian Guard, who, confined to their barracks and stewing in their resentment, decided the time was ripe for another coup. They felt undervalued, even threatened by Pupianus's plans to bring in his own German legions to protect the city, a clear indication of his distrust for the Praetorians themselves. A premonition of their own replacement must have spurred them to act decisively. While the city was distracted by the games, a contingent of the Praetorian Guard marched on the imperial palaces. The emperors, residing in separate wings of the sprawling complex, were caught unaware. Pupianus and Balbinus, despite their deep-seated distrust, found themselves facing a common, terrifying enemy. Pupianus, the old soldier, attempted to summon his German bodyguard, but Balbinus, hearing that Pupianus would use these foreign troops against him once the Praetorian threat was neutralized, refused to cooperate. This final fatal act of paranoia sealed their doom. Without the combined strength of their personal guards, the 2 emperors were helpless. The Praetorians stormed their apartments with brutal efficiency. Pupianus and Balbinus were seized, dragged from their chambers, and subjected to a horrific ordeal. The Praetorians, in a fit of savage rage, stripped them, beat them mercilessly, and then dragged their bleeding bodies through the streets of Rome, parading them before the horrified populace as a chilling testament to their power. The screams of the dying emperors were drowned out by the distant cheers from the games, a macabre counterpoint to the city's grim reality. Finally, they were butchered in the barracks, their bodies left to be desecrated. Just 99 days after being proclaimed emperors by the Senate, Pupianus and Balbinus had met a violent end, another pair of casualties in Rome's bloody succession crisis. In a macabre twist of fate, the chaos inadvertently provided the solution. The Praetorians, having brutally disposed of 2 emperors, now needed a new one. Their choice was as practical as it was opportunistic. The 13-year-old Marcus Antonius Gordianus, or Gordian III, the grandson of Gordian I, who had been elevated to Caesar by the Senate weeks earlier. The Praetorians, dragging the terrified boy from the palace, proclaimed him Augustus. He was an agreeable figurehead, easily manipulated, and his lineage provided a crucial, if superficial, link to the Gordian name, still popular with the people. With this swift, bloody act, the Praetorians had once again asserted their dominance as the ultimate kingmakers in Rome. Thus concluded Rome's chaotic Year of the 6 Emperors: Maximinus Thrax, the barbarian strongman; Gordian I and Gordian II, senatorial rebels; Pupianus and Balbinus, the Senate's desperate champions; and finally the boy emperor Gordian III. 6 emperors, all rising and falling within a single tumultuous year of 238 AD. The events of this year were not merely a footnote in Roman history, they were a thunderclap, signaling a profound shift in the very foundations of the empire. The Senate's prestige, already waning, was shattered. The military, particularly the Praetorian Guard, had demonstrated its unbridled power as the ultimate arbiter of imperial succession. The precedent of violent, rapid changes in leadership had been firmly established, paving the way for the devastating half-century known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome had survived the Year of the 6 Emperors, but it emerged from the ordeal a fractured, traumatized state, poised precariously on the precipice of an age of profound instability.